How do you create a coherent art style? In order to answer that, let's look at this small section of my game and break down why it looks like it does. Or rather, the process I had for creating this style. The core idea relies on a 3-step process, where you need to figure out your desires, your limitations, and from your desires and limitations, create constraints. And these constraints are what's going to define your style. Let's go over these one by one. First, we look at some general themes, or things that I wanted in my game. I wanted the aesthetic to be kinda cute. I wanted the world to be themed around mushrooms. Because of this, I also wanted a forest biome. I wanted to make a 2D side-scroller. I wanted the game to have a professional or clean look. And I wanted the game to feel like an actual world. Some of these themes or desires sound really diffuse, but that's fine. When we make our constraints, we're gonna have to figure out what we mean when we say these things, and what we will have to do in order to achieve it. Now we have a list of desires, essentially describing what we want in our game. Once we have that list, we move on to the next step, which is finding out what our limitations are. So we identify some problems or issues that we might encounter and that we have to solve. The main thing that my art style will have to maintain is high readability. So achieving high readability is one of the main problems that my art style has to solve. This is quite a long topic. I covered it quite a bit in my first video on Hollow Knight clones. Second problem that my style will have to solve is time constraints. I'm drawing this alone, so I don't have too long time to draw. So whatever I want to have can't take too long time to make. Lastly, I'm bad at animating, so I can't have a style that requires good animation, because it's not in my skill set. Now we have defined what we want, and the problems that we are gonna have to work with. And from these things we can work out some constraints. And these constraints are what's going to define our style. So the first one, simple shapes. That is, whatever asset I'm making needs to consist of quite simple shapes. This constraint can be traced back to the fact that I have limited time and I'm bad at animating. So I don't want to make something too complex because it will take too much time and it will most likely look bad because I'm not good enough at making complex things look good. Second, all assets I make will have limited texturing. Once again, because texturing and shading takes time, so I want to avoid it. Third, all assets will have distinct and clean line work, because clean line art is an easy way to achieve high readability and it's a fast method to achieve a professional look. And I'll add right here that these constraints aren't necessarily easy or quick to figure out. This was my first attempt at developing a style. It took an incredible amount of time to draw and it didn't look good. So I knew from my desires and limitations that something had to change. And I tried adding line work and realized that the exact same assets looked much better when they had visible line art. And it was also much faster to draw because I didn't have to care as much about shading. The point here is that I didn't initially have my constraint regarding distinct line art. But before I had this constraint, my limitation regarding time and my desire for a clean aesthetic weren't fulfilled. So next we'll look at a few constraints that all exist in order to ensure that the game feels like an actual world. I will have many layers using 2.5D parallax and more layers in the front than in the back. None of my assets will have sharp edges because they tend to not exist in forests. And I will not have any visible tiles. I need to have a lot of repeatable smaller assets. So things like bushes or rocks, but also unique and larger assets, in order to make it not look like a copy of a copy of a copy. I will have a time limit on all my assets so that I'm not allowed to work on them for too long. Roughly 30 to 60 minutes in my case. And then I have plenty more constraints that are all trying to abide by my desires and limitations. Most of them relate to high readability. And I'm just gonna state these quite quickly. Light palette, atmospheric perspective, high contrast character, blurred background, consistent environment contrast, particle effects, well-defined color palettes for each biome. All of these constraints exist to define my style so that it fits the desire I have for my general themes and also works within my limitations, such as my time constraints and need for high readability. And once you have them, you need to abide by them. You need to make sure that all your assets in some shape or form fit your defined constraints. Because at this point, your art style is defined by these constraints.